Hello, everybody, and welcome to the second Ruth Chaifetz Memorial Lecture. This is actually in honor of my mother's fourth Yahrzeit, which is actually today. Today, we are lucky to have with us Rabbi Yitzchok Breitowitz, and we will be discussing the halachot of tzedakah and maasar. Rabbi Breitowitz is a world-renowned lecturer and rabbinic authority who is the Rav of Kilat Or Sameach and Or Sameach in Jerusalem. Rabbi Breitowitz's scope of knowledge, brilliance, as well as unique ability to grasp complicated material and communicate it clearly to others is legendary. He has lectured extensively throughout the U.S. and Israel on medical, business, and family ethics. He has published numerous articles on bankruptcy, commercial law, medical ethics, and Jewish law. And he has graciously accepted our invitation here today to talk to us. So again, as I mentioned, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. Marcy and I will be moderating the chat. In the meantime, we're gonna, Rabbi Breitowitz will go through quickly the halachot, give like a refresher of the halachot of tzedakah and maasar, and then we'll go into a question and answer period. So without further ado, Rabbi Breitowitz, I'm gonna turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, and I'm certainly honored to participate in the memorial of your mother, and may the Divrei Torah and all the good works that you do be le'ilui nishmata. I had a bit of a relationship with Rebecca. I was involved in reading and reviewing her very excellent book. I have to say that if you were stranded on a desert island and you only take one book, maybe that and a siddur might be the two things that you would take and would kind of get you through your Jewish survival guide in whatever condition you're in. So again, it's a pleasure to participate with you again in this worthy project. The idea of tzedakah is, of course, fundamental to Jewish identity. Let me point out a very interesting thing. The normal translation of tzedakah is charity, and yet in Hebrew, tzedakah is connected to tzedek, which is justice. Meaning charity is not simply a matter, I want to do it, and I'll be nice to people who are my inferiors, but rather it's a matter of justice that you share. Hashem gave us wealth so that we would help those people that are going through difficult situations. In many, many ways, the giver of tzedakah benefits even more than the receiver of the tzedakah. God made people poor to some degree so that we should have the merit of helping them in many, many ways. The pasuk in Mishlei in Proverbs tells us, tzedakah tatzil mimavet. Tzedakah protects a person. It brings blessing into the world. It can even save a person from death. Now, granted, these are not ironclad guarantees because there are other factors in the spiritual world that God takes into account, but certainly it's a tremendous, tremendous, tremendous zechut. So let me just go over a few things. And in particular, in these introductory remarks, I just want to clarify what is tzedakah and what is maasar, just so you have a sense that they are very related concepts, but technically a little bit different. Tzedakah is simply the obligation that is concretized in the Torah itself in Parshat Re'eh, that when you see somebody that is poor, that is lacking something, lacking a necessity of life, and that's to be defined by the overall context. The Gemara says that if the person is used to eating like fancy stuffed chicken every day, then tzedakah requires you give him that. But tzedakah says I have to help a person. Maasar, in a sense, in its most literal sense, is simply the quantification of a tzedakah obligation. Meaning, the Torah itself does not tell me how much I give. Maasar comes and tells me that every Jew, subject to some exemptions, should give 10% of his income, his or her income, for purposes of tzedakah. So all maasar is supposed to be ultimately tzedakah. Now there is a machlokas among the poskim. What is the origin of maasar? The origin of tzedakah is explicit in the Torah. The Torah says, a poor person, you shall open your hand, patoach tiftach es yadcha. Some say maasar is da'oraisa because we derive it from the concept of the grain. Every third and sixth year, you have to give 10% of your grain in Eretz to aniyim, and that is a precedent to the maasar of income. Others say it is a takana, it is a drabanan, although it's a very ancient drabanan that may go as far back as Yaakov Avinu, who vowed to God that if God were to save him, he will give 10%. Well, he says to God, but that's interpreted to tzedakah. Others treat maasar as a venerable minhag and not even a chiyuv drabanan. So we have really extremities here. We have some views that consider it a Torah commandment. Some views consider it a rabbinic enactment dating from Yaakov Avinu, and others consider it to be a minhag, an old custom of Klal Yisrael, which one should keep, but it's not necessarily in the realm of an obligation. Either way, as a general rule, one of the markings of a religious Jew is that they give maasar. Now, there are going to be a lot of questions. Maasar is a very complicated halachic area. In fact, there are a number of books in English and in Hebrew just on the laws of maasar itself. And because of the complexities of society, new types of questions are always coming up. Issue number one is, am I a person who's chayav to give maasar? Meaning, does every single person have to give maasar? The short answer is that not everybody has to give maasar. Just as lahavdil, if your income is below a certain level, there is no obligation to pay income tax. So too, the maasar could be viewed as a type of tax that God imposes on Bnei Yisrael to help those who are poor. And if you are below a certain level, you are patur from maasar, or maybe to put it another way, you can use the maasar for yourself. And essentially the idea is, if halachically you yourself are an ani, if you yourself are poor, you may not be exempt from tzedakah, and I'll explain that, but you may be exempt from maasar. Now, what is the definition of being poor? So it's not a quantifiable thing. Poor is defined by a person who is unable to meet the normal needs of what you would call a middle-class existence. So if, for example, I have difficulty, I would not be able to pay rent, I would not be able to have the basic nutritional meals that people generally have, normal, decent clothing, if I couldn't pay the educational expenses of my children. Under those circumstances, I would be exempt from giving maasar because I myself would qualify as a poor person who could receive my own maasar. Now, being exempt from maasar doesn't mean you're exempt from tzedakah. I mean, let me give you a simple example with some numbers. Let's assume that your basic middle class living standard would require, I'll just make up a number, require 60,000 shekel a year. I'm just making up a number. Now, let's assume that your basic expenses are 55,000 shekel a year. So you're exempt from maasar because maasar would be 6,000, and you don't, that would put you in the red. But anything over and above what would be needed to satisfy your needs, you would be chayav midinei tzedakah. So in a sense, maasar is not an all or nothing. If you can't give 10%, you're exempt, but then you give up to that level, whatever level you're able to give. If you're able to give 2%, 3%, 4%, 1%, that would be wonderful. If you can't even do that, then einachinami, you're more or less patur, except for a very, very minimal, like a few shekel a year type of thing. So that's issue number one. Now, that itself raises a lot of issues, because in calculating my living expenses for purposes of whether I am an ani, what do I include? Do I include a margin for savings? Can I say, for example, that part of my income would go into savings for future emergencies? Can I include things that might be optional but may be necessary, such as summer camp for my kids? Again, you get into a difficult question, which I can't really fully address. Maybe it'll come out in the Q&A, as to what are considered necessities of life and what are considered, luxuries of life. It's very clear you don't have to live on bread and water. That much I can tell you. That much is relatively easy. But beyond that, chicken or meat every day, if you're not a vegetarian, exactly what are we talking about? But issue number one is, are you a person who is chayav in maasar? That's issue number one. Issue number two, and I mean, you can take these issues in any order you want, is what is the income base upon which you compute maser? So here we have some interesting halachos about that. And here the halachos are a little bit more clear. Basically, any expenses that you incurred in the production of your income are actually deductible as maser expenses. It's somewhat similar, once again, to a tax return. So if, for example, you have a business and your gross earnings of the business are a certain amount, you deduct from your gross earnings the cost of goods and your fixed overhead, or your overhead generally, and you only pay maser on your net profit, right? So if you have a business or the like, it's going to be a little complicated. Even if you are on salary, so things like commuting expenses, and that would be true even for something like light rail or gasoline expenses, are deductible, which is a little different than taxes. Under US taxes, you actually cannot deduct commuting expenses from the home, but for maser purposes, you can. If you had to have special uniforms or clothing that you had to get cleaned, that is miyuchad for work, let's say, I don't mean general clothing, that would be deductible. Taxes are deductible. Maser is an after-tax obligation. So
That's super important, everybody, actually, I think, right? Like the after tax, knowing when to calculate the maser.
that's correct. That's correct. Now, it's very important to understand personal expenses are not deductible from maser. In other words, assuming I have enough income to be chayiv in maser, I don't deduct my food, my clothing, my rent. Those are my personal expenses, and I do have to pay maser, assuming that's not going to put me into the red vis-a-vis those expenses. But business expenses, which are connected to the generation of the income, are actually deductible from your maser base. I saw many years ago, I haven't seen it recently, but it ought to be a good idea, that somebody produced a maser form modeled after the US 1040. And it built into the form.
That's neat.
It does. And the truth of the matter is that's a very useful way of calculating maser. That's why some people do have the custom that they give maser on an annual basis. This comes to yet another question, meaning how often? Do you give maser every paycheck? Do you give maser? So the truth of the matter is, it's really up to you. You can make any decision you want. You can even do it once a year if you have a dedicated maser account in which you deposit things. And of course, maser gets the interest. That doesn't come out of your maser. If I put $1,000 of maser money in a bank account, maser gets the interest. But still, at the end of the year, you should try to figure out what you owed and what you didn't owe. And if you paid extra, you can use it as a credit towards next year's obligation. That is treated as a loan to the maser fund, which is payable from maser money next year if you need to do that. So it's a little complicated. I think when Mashiach comes, we're going to have halachic accountants. Maybe even that we can have such people because it's necessary to expense. So issue number one is a yuchayiv in maser. Issue number two is what is your income base? Issue number three is how often do you pay? So that I indicated, I think it is a good idea to have a designated maser account, which is exclusively maser money, not commingled. So you put it in right away, but then you can adjust it during the year based on losses and the like and different needs. Now, issue number four.
So wait, so can I clarify that for a second?
Yeah.
So are you saying that if, let's say you make, $100 each week, then you would put $10 aside every week, and then if one week you made $50, you could deduct from the overage? Like you're predetermining, is that what you're saying, to put aside?
Yeah.
Or can you just make a calculation at the end of the year? This year I made $100,000, so I'll give $10,000.
So generally speaking, you calculate at the end of the year, but you make interim judgments in the middle of the year that you can then adjust either plus or minus. Meaning, you might get like a tax refund. It's like estimated taxes. You might get something back or you might have to put something in. But I do think it's helpful, it's useful not to wait until the end of the year to do, before you do anything. I think it'll be too overwhelming a little bit. So it's easier to, I mean, as an organizer, this, it's easier to handle it in small pieces,
Yes.
and then make adjustments at the end. But again, as I say, halakhically, you can actually do it at the end of the year if you want to do it that way. But I do think the designated master account is a very, very useful thing, because that way you do have a running tally of your master money, and it's not going to just be a guess or an estimate. You'll be able to be fairly exact.
So from a practical standpoint, if you're getting paid every 2 weeks or every week, you should deduct it every week, put it in there, save it till you do your taxes, kind of,
Yes.
and then figure out if that's the correct amount.
I believe that makes the most sense, actually. That's the easiest way to handle it.
If you find that during the year there's a need to give to somebody urgently, you would say give it to as needed, right? You don't have to hold it.
Sure. I didn't mean to suggest that you have to lock it into the account. I mean, after all, maasar is designed ultimately to be distributed. So you can distribute throughout the year, but you would just keep a record of what went in, what went out, and then you'd actually calculate at the end what it is that you owed or what it is that you're owed.
I have a spreadsheet. That's my thing. I love spreadsheets.
Yeah, so this is where a good organizer can actually help with maasar calculations. I'm not sure if it was covered. Was it covered in the book? I don't know if it was covered in the book, but
I didn't actually talk about that in the book now, but
second edition, you can
yeah.
put it. Okay. But either event, this is the idea. Now, the next question is a big question, because this I get a million questions about this. Okay, I know my income base. I take off my maasar, and I calculate it, and I know what I have to give. What do I give it to? What can I use maasar money for? This is the distribution issue, and that's a very big issue. And I think, unfortunately, people are a little more lenient than they ought to be in this particular area. You find that people think they can use it for anything, a lulav, an esrog, whatever. So let me just explain what's going on. Maasar should be used for two primary purposes. One is to help the poor, and the other is for the support of Torah learning. Those are the designated uses for maasar. Now, helping the poor can itself be a very relative idea. A person might be poor even if they're not starving to death. And let me point out that helping, and this is very important in Israel in particular, helping your adult children who are in kollel, and you no longer have a responsibility to support them. You can absolutely use maasar funds to help them, because if they have difficulty living middle class standard, they are called aniyim, and they may even have priority. So the basic concept is you can't use maasar for your own obligations. I should not use maasar to buy my tefillin, to buy my lulav and esrog, to pay my synagogue dues, to pay the obligatory tuition for my children when they're still children, let's say below 18 or whatever it is, unless I qualify as an ani, so then I could use it. That goes back to the very, very first issue. But once it is a person that I have no obligation to support, such as my adult children, single or married, at that point I can use maasar. Now, ideally, I gave the example of kollel, but the truth of the matter is, as somebody just asked, even if they're not in kollel, if they're working or not working, and they have difficulty making ends meet, I can use my maasar to support them. Now, again, you're going to get into the same issue of what is a luxury and what is a necessity. I don't mean I can support my children so they can take trips to the Riviera every other year. But if we're talking about kids that have a genuine difficulty just living middle class life, then they're poor. They're halakhically poor, and may even be a priority. So maasar is used for the support of Torah learning, support of Torah institutions, and or to help those who are in financial need. You do not generally use maasar for your own mitzvot. You don't use maasar for your own personal needs unless you qualify as an ani. If you qualify as an ani, then you can effectively give some of the maasar to yourself. Now, one interesting question is, what about maasar to what you might call general causes that benefit people? Like you want to give it to a hospital, Yahrzeit, or you want to give it to medical research, cancer research. These are important. Or even things like protecting the environment, social activism causes that you consider to be worthwhile, that are worthwhile. Well, it is interesting. It's not clear that maasar should be used for that, but I will give you something else that can be used for that as well. But again, you have to focus on the core mission. The core mission of maasar is aniyim and hachzakat, support of Torah. That is what maasar is for. Now,
So is something like food rescue considered helping the poor?
Absolutely so. Absolutely so. A food rescue program is designed to make these resources available to low-income people. So even though you're funneling it through an organizational structure, that would be a valid use of maasar. Like everything else, though, whenever you're giving to an organization, whether it's maasar or not maasar, you'll want to check out the overhead and the expenses to be sure that most of the aid is going to where it's supposed to go. I mean, that's a major problem in all charitable giving.
Right.
Assuming it's a good, properly run, managed organization, they can receive maasar in that way. So paying for your own child's tuition generally is not a maasar use, but if you're paying to a scholarship fund to give scholarships to needy families, that would be a legitimate use.
Okay. So it depends what the organization is doing if you want to give to an organization, basically.
Yeah, that's correct. Now, let me
I think
point
a lot of people don't actually know, like, poor people, like, to give to directly, or don't have a way to funnel money to them directly if they do.
That's very true. So for the most part, most of us fulfill our maasar obligation through organizations, through yeshivot, through Jewish institutions. For Tzedakah, there's Yad Eliezer in Israel. And again, there are many, many worthy organizations. And in fact, there are also websites, Jewish websites, that evaluate and even provide some type of audit function for these Jewish organizations. You may want to check them out. There was a fellow, years ago, remember Ira Kamenow, who was an economist in the Washington area, who was working on a comprehensive website, going through all of the data that's available on the part of these organizations. So it might be something just to check out. Now, let me mention that maasar is something that everybody should try to do unless they qualify as ani. But there's something that's even higher than maasar. Some people give an extra 10%. So altogether, they give 20%, again, subject to all the deductions before. That's called chomesh. And it's interesting that vis-a-vis the second 10%, you have actually more flexibility than vis-a-vis the first 10%. So if you're a person who's able, again, I'm not pushing this, but if you are able to go up to chomesh, you can actually stipulate on the second 10% that this will include environmental causes, this will include civil rights organizations, hospitals, medical research. So in the chomesh, you can actually specify that your intention is to use this for other meritorious causes that may not qualify as the ani and the hachzakas Torah. So if you can afford it, chomesh might be the avenue by which, the second 10% where you can do it. Now, what if you want to give more than chomesh, right? Like Bill Gates, whatever, gives 50%. So it's interesting. The Talmud actually says you should not give more than 20% because you might be jeopardizing the financial security of your own family. So Chazal kind of had this feeling that although you should be generous, there is some point that you shouldn't cross because you might be hurting your family. And yet I have to say that the Achronim in the course of the years have found a lot of loopholes that if you really want to give more than chomesh, we give you permission to do that as well. If you're very comfortable, if you're very wealthy. So if giving 30% or 40% doesn't hurt you, so to speak. So talk to your rabbi about that. In fact, even if it's a question of giving the chomesh, I think that's something you should talk to the rabbi about, or your financial planner as well, because we do very much believe that you got to take care of your family, and the notion that your family does have priority over everything else, and that's an important Jewish value as well. So that's kind of what it is. As I say, there's some very, very excellent books on maasar, both in Hebrew and in English, which are accessible, available, and the like. Now, one final issue is the relationship. Once again, let's revisit it between tzedakah and maasar.
Okay.
Let's assume I've separated my maasar and I've distributed it, right? I finished my maasar, I've given my 10%. And now I'm walking in the street and people put out their hands and for this money, that money, or I get fundraising letters or different email appeals or whatever it is. Am I obligated to respond at all once I have fulfilled my maasar obligation? So it's interesting that technically you are not obligated, because basically maasar maxes you out in terms of your tzedakah. In other words, the amount of tzedakah you have to give is defined by maasar or chomesh. However, there's one limited exception, and that is a direct personal appeal that is a face-to-face. You are obligated to give something if you have it, but it can be very, very small. I'm talking about a shekel. I'm talking about 2 shekels, meaning you don't have to do any major giving after your maasar, but you should not refuse a face-to-face appeal with some minimal amount. Now, because of this, I would caution people, and it's going to be a hard question, not necessarily to give away all their maasar in a piecemeal way, because you see what the problem is. The problem basically is I separate this 10%, and like every day I give it away. Well, what's going to be if 8 months into the year, there's a real, serious need that has to be met? Well, I have a few choices. I could decide to go over and above my maasar obligation, okay, which if I can afford it, I can afford it. Or I'm putter from giving, which makes me feel pretty bad. But if the idea is I keep my maasar, some of my maasar in abeyance to be available for greater needs as they materialize, I will then have a fund. It works. It's the same psychological dynamic as any type of saving. You're saving in case there's a greater need that will materialize in the future. That is a legitimate calculation for charity as well. That you have this charity account, and you want to be able to evaluate all of the different competing causes, so you can then allocate your priorities. Now, priorities themselves are difficult. It's one thing for me to say, oh, poor people and achzakat Torah, okay, that's fine. But within those categories, you're going to have 100 choices to make. And it's very, very hard. I mean, this is something I agonize over. I mean, I don't have a clear answer. I will tell you, surprisingly, that many, many poskim say that you can be guided by conscience and intuition, meaning somehow our neshamos tend to gravitate to certain causes over other causes, certain types of yeshivot or certain types of organizations. And that has a legitimacy, so to speak, because Hashem calibrates our neshama to be sensitive to different things, so that all of these needs are going to be met. So some people are into this need, and some people are into this need. And if everybody were to give to the same need, there would be a lot of needs that would simply be unmet. So if you find that you gravitate towards particular types of causes, that may be a heavenly omen, a heavenly sign that that's where you might invest some of your efforts. For example, something like, some people donate to organizations that print svarim, like the Art Scroll, the Maasar Heritage Foundation, and they subsidize the printing of svarim. Now, that's not directly going to the poor, but that is something that is greatly facilitating the availability of Torah learning. So some look at that as a beautiful cause, and other people, that leaves them a little cold because it's not helping a flesh and blood person.
Right. So, but both are considered acceptable for maasar.
That's correct. That's correct. They're both acceptable for maasar. So that's where your conscience and your autonomy comes into it. So halacha does not always tell you exactly what you have to do. It gives you parameters, and then it gives you the leeway to kind of make the judgments of where you want to go. So that's kind of my little overview of things.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay, so I actually have a question, and then I'll get to the list here, specifically about volunteering as part of, like, if you're poor, but you have time, let's say, or if you're not poor and you want to, like, also contribute, how can you, is there a way to deduct kilu, or if you, let's say, run a business and maybe you don't have cash on hand to donate to somebody, can you create sort of like a scholarship to help within your business as part of your maasar deduction?
Yeah, so this is an interesting question that has a number of aspects. First, let me just point out that besides tzedakah and maasar and chomesh, there is something else that is called gemilot chasadim, and that's acts of loving kindness. And indeed, the Gemara in Sukkah says that one of the differences between tzedakah and gemilot chesed is tzedakah is with your money and gemilot chesed is with your time and your energy. So when I go out and I help paint your house or I help you move, that's gemilot chesed. However, interestingly enough, gemilot chesed can enter into maasar calculations as well, and that is if you are a professional who charges for a given service and you donate your service. So for example, you're a doctor, you donate an hour of your time or an afternoon of your time to a clinic that services low-income people, or a lawyer or an accountant or a consultant, whatever it might be. So halachically, as the saying goes, time is money, but this is a little interesting. You can deduct, this is a little complicated, 90% of your hourly rate from your maasar obligation. What that means practically is the following. Let's assume I earn, I'll make up a number, 100,000 net. So my maasar obligation is 10,000. I donated an hour of my service. I can treat 90% of that as a deduction from my maasar obligation. Now, the reason we go with 90% is the following. We treat a time is money arrangement as if you received the money and then gave it back. Now, if I would have gotten paid, I would have had to take off 10% from maasar anyway. So when I give it all back, it's only a 90% extra contribution. So as a result, the time is money formula allows you to deduct 90% of your hourly rate from your maasar obligation, because you have to imagine it as if you received it and then gave it all back. So you see that would have raised your maasar bill.
Yes, exactly. Okay, so
way where you could alleviate a cash flow shortage if you have a difficulty with the cash flow by simply donating services, and they would be maasar. But they would have to be the services that you would normally charge for. They wouldn't just be chesed, generic chesed and the like.
perfect. Okay, so that answers the first question, which was what's the difference between gemilot chasim and tzedakah? And then we had some other really interesting questions. Hang on one second. I'm just trying to move my screen here. Doesn't seem to be working. There we go. Okay. What about, okay, so what if your adult children are not in kollel, but they're not earning much money, which you answered already? How do we calculate interest on a maasar account?
Well, if it is a designated segregated account, you calculate the interest based on the interest that the bank
is offering, right?
It just basically means anything that is generated by maasar money is maasar money. So therefore, the interest or the appreciation allocable to a maasar asset automatically belongs to the maasar asset, and that does not count towards your obligation.
Okay. On a practical level, a lot of people separate their maasar like automatically. So they have on their credit card, let's say, set up a monthly donation to a certain organization that fulfills the maasar requirement, how much activeness, for lack of a better word, needs to be involved in you doing this mitzvah? Like, is it okay to automate it?
Yeah, this is a very interesting philosophical question, meaning if you're asking me as a Rav, does halacha permit you to simply automate the process and never look at it again? The answer is yes. You're doing the mitzvah, you're doing the mitzvah. There is no particular requirement that you get involved. However, as a chinuch man, I want to train my children to appreciate the importance of giving. It's something you got to think about, meaning maybe I want my kids to see me writing a check. I want my kids to see me actually interacting with an ani, if there is an ani, or a Rosh Yeshiva, or a Rosh Kollel, and to do so, especially, we didn't talk about this, but B'sever Panim Yafos, with a pleasant countenance. I think that conveys very important educational, spiritual lessons. And that's something you have to think about. But on the other end, that doesn't mean every single maasar payment has to be that way. You could set up a situation where 95% of it is taken care of by automation. And then you have a certain, little part of it that there's some personal touch that's still there. So every person has to work with their schedule. But I see from the question that there is a sense that you want to convey certain attitudes to your kids that maybe are only conveyable by that personal touch and involvement.
Okay. So let's say you derive benefit from giving maasar, not just on like a personal level, but like you're giving with your credit card and there's rewards.
Yeah.
So then are you obligated to give the rewards from that? Or is that like, how does that, what would that category of rewards fall into?
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. Let me start with a slightly different hypothetical, but it's the same issue. If an organization like a yeshiva or whatever it is having a banquet, and you donate to the banquet, but you also show up and you get a meal. So how much? So let's assume that a place at the banquet, and making up numbers, is $100, but you get a dinner. So it actually is brought down. You can only use maasar money up to the amount, you have to deduct the amount that this dinner would cost you in a restaurant. So the restaurant, if the dinner would cost you $25, then you cannot deduct the whole 100 from maasar. You can only deduct $75, and the $25 is regarded as a personal expense, and it's not a maasar deduction. So that's a cheshbon that you have to make. It gets more complicated with raffles. Let's assume that I give money towards a raffle, which in all probability I'm going to lose. So there, you can kind of wait and see, meaning if you lose, the whole thing is going to be deductible. If you win, you have to maybe make a cheshbon of treating the prize as a new income item from which you have to take up. Although I do want to say one thing about that. I didn't mention this before. The obligation of maasar is on cash or cash equivalents, meaning to say, if you win a car, let's say you win a car, you don't have to take maasar until you liquidate the car and it's in a cash-ready form.
Oh, interesting.
For wedding presents, if a chassan and kala get wedding presents, they do have to take maasar off the cash and checks, assuming they're not poor. They do not have to take maasar off the appliances and other things until they sell them, right? So that's something to know as well. There, when you're dealing with credit card rewards, you may have to adjust it. Meaning there are you either, well, some say you actually do actuarial calculations, meaning. Well, these are not raffles. These are actual rewards. You actually have rewards.
Yeah, like you get cash, like on my credit card, I get cash back when I, a certain percentage, like 2% cash back on every transaction, let's say.
Yeah. So the issue would be, let me think there. That's not see, the problem here is that's not affecting the recipients of the maasar, meaning they're getting the full.
Correct.
Thing.
They're getting the full amount. I'm just getting a reward for doing it.
The full thing. So as a result, that is a legitimate use of maasar. You're getting a benefit back, but I would say that if the benefit back is simply a discount on future purchases, that is not a benefit upon which maasar is imposed. That's simply a sale. I mean, if you buy something at a cheaper price, that does not generate a maasar obligation. So I would say that benefits in the form of discounts on future reductions on future purchases would not generate any hitchayvut of maasar. On the other hand, if you actually get cash back, if there's actually some type of money that appears in your bank account, you would have to take maasar on that. That would be treated as fresh income that has its own maasar obligation.
Got it. Okay. All right. So let's dive into some of the questions here. Does maasar have to be equally divided between poor and Torah support, or can it be more heavily distributed to one side? I think you answered that already by saying, like, let your neshama guide you, right?
That's correct. It's not a 50-50 split.
Okay. Does the payments to my son's Rebbe for his private learning count as maasar?
That's a very excellent question. I would say it does count as maasar, because as long as your son is in school, in the cheder, there is no obligation for you to do more. So therefore, this would count as maasar tzedakah hachzakas Torah.
Okay. What if your in-laws took the wedding money, cash and checks to pay for their side of the wedding? Is maasar only on what the chatan and kala receive directly?
Yes, very much so. Very much so. If the chassan v'kala did not have unfettered use of the money, there is no obligation for maasar. And in fact, I'll even give you a bigger example. If your in-laws or anyone gives you money and earmark that money for a specific use, and they tell you it's not to be used for anything else, you do not owe maasar on that money because you didn't have unfettered use of it. That's why people raise the question, do I have to take maasar on gift cards or whatever it is? Short answer is, it may be, if it's an all-purpose card like Amazon, where you could buy virtually anything, that might be a cash equivalent. But if it's a specialty card that can only be used for a small range of things and you can't cash it in, you're not obligated to. It's like getting a dishwasher or something. You're not obligated to pay maasar on it.
Okay. What happens when you're the recipient of maasar?
Yeah, so the question becomes, must the recipient of maasar give maasar? So it kind of depends on how much maasar you give, meaning to say, if besach hakol, after everything you receive, you need this money for your basic needs, you're exempt from giving maasar. If, on the other hand, Baruch Hashem, you've received so much that you are able to meet your basic needs with a surplus, then at that point, maasar would kick in. So it really depends on how blessed you have been with the maasar receipts.
Gotcha. Okay. Hold on. Having a little trouble scrolling here. Okay. Okay. So a lot of times parents give children money, like for a specific need, like camp for grandkids or something, because they need it because they're working, let's say, and that would technically fulfill the obligation. If you received it, I think because the question is what if I get money from a family member? Do I give maasar on that? But then there was an earlier question, which is, can I use my maasar money to send my grandkids to camp? Which to me falls under the necessary expenses of, yes, you can if your children need it, so that like it's a need because they need to have childcare, right? Because there's no school. So then you wouldn't give it on that because it's going directly to supporting that, right?
Yeah. So the issue of summer camp is how vital a need is it? And in many, many cases, it is a need. In some cases, it's a luxury. That's going to be a difficult question. But once again, though, if the money was earmarked to be used exclusively for summer camp, whether or not you can use maasar, which is a separate issue, there's no chiyuv to give maasar on that benefit, because maasar attaches only to funds in which the recipient has the unfettered right to use.
Right. Amazing. Okay. Were there any other questions? There was a couple other. I'm having trouble getting to the list here. Can maasar just continue as a running account / tab? For example, if I paid full tuition over 1 year, I know I helped others who could not pay it. So now this year I give a little less, even though I'm still earning the same amount of money.
Well, yeah, the truth of the matter is, it's very, very interesting that the halacha of maasar as a halacha literally has no time period at all, meaning you can do it once in your whole life. You can say every 50 years, I'm going to make an aggregate calculation. Generally speaking, the rule that the poskim give is you can calculate maasar obligations in any manner that would be reasonable for a business to calculate its profits and losses. So you can do so. So when I keep on mentioning year, and I kept on using year throughout this talk, I was mentioning the way it commonly is done. Commonly, it is done on a year-by-year basis. That seems to be the standard minhag. But technically, you can go over different years. And as I say, if you gave more this year, you can treat it as a loan against a future maasar obligation and pay yourself back. If there was a deficit, you can make it up next year. So you can advance. In other words, I could give extra money this year to reduce my maasar obligation next year. That's treated halachically, that's treated as a loan to the maasar account, which I pay back next year, and that's called legitimate. Now, again, though, when you're doing that, which is a bit more complex, try not to guesstimate. Because since you're paying yourself back from tzedakah money, you want to be sure that you're not taking more than you're entitled to take.
Right.
So,
Okay. Okay. So we just have time for like 2 more questions here, and there were 2 really good ones. If someone is making a request of you for tzedakah, does it matter if it's face to face or in a phone call, or even on an email or a text message? Because a lot of times we're getting requests that way.
Yep. It's very interesting. So again, I myself don't have a definitive proof, but I heard a psak from Rav Chaim Kanievsky that the rule that you must give at least something, even if it's small, only applies directly to a face-to-face request. It does not email. It does not apply to phone calls. It's the person you bump into in the street. So most of these requests are evaluated on their own merits, but there's no automatic obligation that you have to respond to them.
What if you give to someone and you find out that they're not in need?
Yeah. So that's very unfortunate. I mean, Baruch Hashem, I don't know, Baruch Hashem, most people in need are in need. I know Baruch Hashem is something
Yes.
I'm sad about.
There's con people out there.
In a way, if they're not in need, say Baruch Hashem that they're not in need. But I think you have to know that Chazal tell us that Hashem counts a good thought like a good action. And if you sincerely intended to help someone who was in need, Hashem will give you the reward of tzedakah, even though you did not actually fulfill the mitzvah. Now, what that does mean, though, here's what it means. What it does mean is, however, you still owe that money as part of your maasar account. Meaning, if I diverted my maasar, which could be catastrophic sometimes, if I diverted my maasar account to causes that turned out to be fraudulent, I have the obligation to make that up. So, and spiritually, I get reward, but lemaisa, I misused money for a wrongful purpose. So I do have a chiyuv to make it up.
Well, what's your obligation to verify if you see someone standing in front of you? This happens a lot, like in New York. You see somebody in the subway and they're like, I need tzedakah, and then there's no way for you to verify if.
One, the halacha is absolutely, in fact, I should qualify this. When I said before, if there's a face-to-face, you got to respond with something. I want to qualify. That is only if there's some type of validation the person has. Now, the truth is, it's not hard to get validation, but some letter. They have to have a letter. They have to have some type of substantiation, except which is its own unique rules. You do not have to accept anybody's claim unless they are asking directly for food, which is rare. If they say, do you have some food to give me? So there you have to be afraid the guy's going to drop dead of starvation or something. But if they ask for money, you are entitled to ask for some type of verification. You do not have to give.
Okay. Is it still so I I don't know if other people are like this also, but I never have cash. So if someone asks me for money on the street, I can't usually give them any money because I don't ever have cash. But I always have food in my purse, so I always am willing to like hand them off some food. And if they're willing, I'm, happy to give it to them. So my question is that the same on a practical level? Is that the same?
Yeah, a lot of,
Have you fulfilled your obligation?
I include myself. I often don't have cash on me. So sure, I don't have coins. It's often the case I don't have coins, and you're not obligated. If the only thing you have is a 200 shekel, you're not obligated 200 shekel to any person who asks you.
Right.
It's a very nice idea. As I say, food in some ways is the highest tzedakah, that if somebody says they want food, you give it to them without verification. And I would also add this, I'm not sure how they react. Do people react positively or negatively or neutral when you offer them food?
Well, I find that if they're really in need, they're totally fine with the protein bars that I have, stuffed in my purse all the time. Because I always have one with me because I never know if I'm going to need it.
I think there's also an aspect of gemilut chesed, meaning besides the financial support that either you're giving them or not able to really give them, but you're showing that you're thinking about them, you're showing that you care about them. That's something meaningful too, because very, very often, we may throw money at people and maybe they'll get the money, maybe they'll even do well in terms of their collection.
Right.
But we don't give them a look, we don't pay any attention to them. And the Rambam writes that this is not a maasar halacha per se, this is a general tzedakah halacha,
Right.
that often the respect and regard that you show the ani may be even more important than the amount of money that you give. So I think overall it's a good thing to do.
Okay, so one final question, because I think that this is actually very relevant. You said you sort of touched on it. The question is that you said that if a couple receives appliances, then they only have to take maasar once they cash out. Like if they receive gifts, then if they sell them, they have to give maasar on the proceeds from the sale. But what if they never cash out on them? Like what if they just die and you're buying something new? Then what happens?
As far as I know, there is no maasar obligation that attaches until it is reducible to a cash equivalent. Maasar. So if it goes via Yerusha, it can go to Yerusha for many generations without a maasar.
Halavai, a refrigerator should last that long. Okay. Rabbi Breitowitz, thank you so much for joining us today. I really, really appreciate it. I dearly hope that this was an aliyah for my mother's neshama, Esther Bat Yitzchak V'Sarah. If you registered for the event today, I will enclose Rabbi Breitowitz's email in the recording link, and you can message him directly if you have any additional questions. And I really appreciate everybody being here today. Did you have any final closing thoughts, Rabbi?
Yeah, I just want to mention one thing. I get this question a lot from my students in Or Sameach, that the Shulchan Aruch says, based on the Gemara, that you can test God, that tzedakah will make you rich, that by giving tzedakah, I'll be rich. Everyone wants to know, well, if I give tzedakah, can I be rich? Does that guarantee I'll be rich? And I just want to point out that for a variety of reasons, you can't really test God in that way, despite the language of the Shulchan Aruch. And I'll give you, there are a lot of reasons actually, but I'll give you two basic reasons. Reason number one is that being number one, it doesn't say when you'll get rich. Maybe you'll get rich 50 years from now. It's not a short-term guarantee. Reason number two is, what's the definition of rich? Rich doesn't mean Bill Gates. Today, even a poor person would be richer than many people throughout most of human history in terms of basic necessities. And reason number three is, even if tzedakah is a power that brings wealth, there are other averot that we do that push us in the direction of poverty. So as a result, in any human life, there are forces that are pulling in opposite directions. So even if you're not rich, you're not as poor as you would be without the tzedakah. So in a sense, you can't look at the tzedakah as guaranteeing wealth, but it is a force that pulls in the direction of wealth, but it has to be weighed with other forces. So don't test HaKadosh Baruch Hu in that particular way. But give tzedakah because it's a good thing to do. Give tzedakah because, as Chazal say, He who has compassion on others will have compassion from Hashem. And particularly in a time of war, in a time of tzara, Am Yisrael needs the rachamim of Hashem. And the way we get the rachamim from Hashem is having rachamim for those who are in need.
So in this situation, when we have obligations for like redeeming captives or helping to, keep soldiers safe, is that I mean, they're not rich. I mean, they're not poor necessarily, and they are not not specifically for Torah learning. Does that fall under a valid use of maasar money at this time?
It's complicated. Pidyon Shavuyin, redeeming captives, to the extent that our money could go towards that, certainly can be used. Maasar money can be used. Now, the various programs for chayolim is actually a very, very difficult question. These are very worthy causes for sure, and there's no question that the second chomish, the second 10%, can absolutely be earmarked. You can even 100% if you want for that type of cause. It is less clear if the chayolim are themselves not in a state of aniyim, that this would qualify. Now, if there's a shortage in the army of medical supplies, if there's a shortage of clothing for the winter, then Eino Chinami, a chayal is an ani. He doesn't have the medicine he needs. He doesn't have the weapons he needs. He doesn't have the clothing he needs. So the fact that he's middle class in civilian life is irrelevant. You certainly can use maasar for that. But if you're talking about recreational programs that give the soldiers chizuk, and again, these are very important. I am not at all minimizing it. It's not so pashut to me that maasar money could be used for that.
Excellent. Okay. I hope that answered everybody's questions. But again, as I said, if you have more questions, I will include Rabbi Breitowitz's email in the replay email that I'll send out in a couple of hours. And I appreciate you all being here today with me and my family who is here with us also. And Rabbi, I really thank you for your time and your guidance and your knowledge and sharing it with us. And may we all see the coming of Mashiach very soon.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you.
Have a beautiful day, everybody.